Friends, would you please join with me in the spirit of prayer? Gracious God, in this time of celebration, reminders of ways that we are connected to one another, woven together in a garment of mutuality, continue to sing to us the truths of Christmas, how you come to us in those messy manger moments. You come to us in times that aren't always convenient, in ways that we can't always rationalize or wrap our minds around. But God, continue to warm our hearts and guide our souls every day as 2024 dwindles and 2025 dawns. May we ground ourselves always in the promise of Emmanuel, that God, you are here. In the name of the one we greet, that little sweet baby born away in a manger, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Amen. The Gospel of Mark decides that the best way to begin telling the story of Jesus' life is not with a messy manger, not with scratchy straw in a stable with shepherds there in awe. Not with people singing, "Go tell it on the mountain." No, there's none of that. If you listen to the way Mark begins his gospel that Priscilla just beautifully read to us, there's no "Hark the Herald Angels" singing, no angels from the realms of glory. There's not a single wise person there. There was no gold, no frankincense, no myrrh. No, not a zip, zilch, none of that. I dare say that the gospel writer who penned Mark, he might not have even had a nativity set. Talk about the Grinch who stole Christmas. But what Mark does have, what Mark does offer us on this, the last Sunday of 2024, is a bold, brash reminder of God's truth. Mark actually begins with this powerful, profound statement: good news. Now, for those of you who have been in church for a while, I know that phrase, good news, sounds pretty commonplace, pretty ho-hum. If you've listened to any amount of sermons over your life, you've probably heard preachers just like me shout those words, good news, so many times that maybe today you're finding yourself even suppressing just a bit of a yawn. Good news? Good news? We have to constantly remind ourselves that Mark is using those words during the time of the Roman Empire. And that those words, good news, that's what Caesar said that he and he alone brought. Caesar had what was known as an evangelion, a good news, a gospel, if you would. And the gospel, the good news of Caesar, was brought with a sword and with terror and with threats of a cross. You see, the good news was preached and proclaimed by a messenger of Caesar who would come after Caesar conquered and claimed your village as part of the Roman Empire. And that good news was that, congratulations, you can now pay taxes. Congratulations, you now need to worship Caesar as the Son of God, that Caesar alone is the Prince of Peace. Caesar claimed all those titles. And so when you hear today Priscilla reading those words, good news of great joy, I don't want you to don't miss that Mark is appropriating political speak here. He's taking something that Caesar and Caesar alone claimed as his own and saying, not so fast. God's up to something here that's even better news. than the world out there. Now, quick Bible nerd fun fact here. If you look in your bulletin at that first verse Priscilla read, Mark 1:1, the good news of Jesus Christ, I want you to note that it's not actually a complete sentence in the original language. As a matter of fact, if you turned that first verse into your professor, it would come back to you dripping and drenched with red ink, just like many of my seminary papers were. It's an incomplete sentence because actually most scholars believe that what Mark is saying here is almost shouting like a headline. You know, a headline that you would read in a newspaper. Good news! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Or you could even take that first verse of chapter 1 in Mark and translate it as saying, wake up. Wake up. Just like what your mother shouted to you every morning before school. Only Mark wants you to wake up to God's presence. Right here, right now in our world. God who is Emmanuel, God who rests, God who resides, God who resists the good news that the world wants to try to sell us. There is a different good news that Mark is trying to share with us that I think we need now more than ever. Of course, we can lay this good news that Mark is offering us alongside the headlines that you read in the newspaper on your phone before coming to church today. You know, those headlines that talked about airplane crashes this last week. Headlines that talked about ongoing violence in Ukraine and Russia and the Middle East and the Sudan. School shootings in our own country. Headlines that talk about how our leaders keep criticizing and belittling one another and then saying that the other people are the problem. Headlines from our own community. The ways our neighbors are trying to recover after the storms, the hurricanes this last summer. The headlines of the increased number of people who are without homes, our own siblings, our neighbors who can't afford to live here. Our own neighbors who can't afford to make ends meet here in one of the wealthiest communities in Florida. Those headlines that we read, we lay alongside Mark's headline. It's trying to speak to the heart line in each of our lives. I don't want to diminish. I don't want us to rush past the tension that's there. Those puzzle pieces don't fit neat and tidy together. Take it even one step further. Because the headlines aren't only out there, they're also in you. Every single one of you has headlines in your own heart. Every single one of us has a story we tell ourselves, about where we're at in the world. Have you ever listened? Have you ever actually listened to the stories you tell about yourself to someone else? It's a wonderful prayer practice. It's a challenging prayer practice. Listen to the stories you tell about yourself to others. Are you always the hero or shero of the story? Or are you sometimes the zero of the story? Or sometimes in between? Maybe the story you tell yourself about yourself to others is about trying to follow the light of Christ in the world today. Or maybe the story you tell about yourself is how everything is going to you nowhere in a handbasket and you're the only one who can see it. Or maybe the story you tell about yourself to others is that you are just one more podcast, one more book, one more Zoom webinar away from realizing the good news of God's presence. Oh, that one hits close to home for me. Maybe the stories you tell about yourself is, why bother? Why bother in the world today? There's too much brokenness. There's no way we can fix it. Or maybe you're at the other extreme of constantly racing and running around, over-functioning, trying to solve everything. Listen. Listen this week to the stories you tell yourself and others about yourself. And I want you to know that that's going to take a minute. Might even take a lifetime to try to unravel all those stories that we share and that we hear from one another. It's sort of like Christmas tree lights that get all tangled and twisted together. Christmas tree lights that you promised yourself you'd put back neat and tidy after Christmas. Just a friendly reminder to you as you think about putting the decorations away this year. You see, Mark has a headline, good news, to speak to the heartline of all people. And it makes complete sense to me that this good news comes out of the wilderness. Did you hear that? John the Baptizer comes out of the wilderness. Because the wilderness, that's a place where you and I and we all receive mail in our lives. You carried a wilderness location with you into the sanctuary this morning. For me, I carry the wilderness of trying to be a parent to 2 college-age young adults. I carry the wilderness of trying to be a pastor, walk among you as faithful people in the church today, which has changed so much since I was in seminary. I carry the wilderness of the messy manger moments that I'm not always sure I want God to be present in. I'd rather God show up when everything is perfectly polished and wonderful. What does it mean that God meets us in the wilderness with good news? And I want to be clear that you're going to feel some tension as you hold that close to your heart. Your mind is going to want to argue that this doesn't make any sense. So we have to keep coming back to the truth that Mark is speaking to people oppressed by the Roman Empire. Their sandal was on the people of God's neck. That it wasn't a time when everything was holly jolly and bright. There was no Hallmark Channel with endless Christmas shows to warm your heart. There was no pastor who had some singing pickle to share on Christmas Eve. It's still up here if anybody wants to see it. There was none of that. There was always this tension between the good news and the headlines of the world around us. This good news of God's presence in our lives. The headline that speaks to our heart line. And as we continue to hold that, as we continue to let it sing to our heads, to our hearts, to our souls, to our very lives, I think it's always good to remind ourselves that this good news, this story of Jesus' birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection, that story is seeking to gospel speak good news into your life. Remember that in Jesus' life, he was often mistaken, misunderstood, faced the misery of the cross and people rejecting him and pushing him to the fringe and fray. Good news? That doesn't sound like good news in a society that loves fame and fortune and followers on social media. There's always been this tension for us as people of faith to be of good news. Always feels a bit like a salmon swimming upstream. It always feels like people might be snickering behind our backs or shaking their heads like they don't understand what we're saying. And yet, there's something in our souls, I believe, that sing out the good news of God's presence every day. And so this week, I have an invitation for you. I want you to review the headlines of your life this last week. On today, tomorrow, Tuesday, sit down, look at the headlines of your life. Where in 2024 did you find hope? Where was there heartbreak? Where were there just some ho-hum days that you can barely remember? Where in 2024 did you experience rebellious joy? Or maybe some pain that you're still trying to process? Don't only look at the headlines on page 1. Review the newspaper of your entire life this past year. Dig deep into those buried sections on page 9 and 10, those tiny articles that maybe you'd even forgotten about from this last year. Because the truth is, God was there. God is here. And after holding this last year, take that next step and pray your prayers for the coming year, for 2025. Where do you long for God's hope, peace, love, and joy to enter in? And I want to encourage you to be specific. Be specific about where you long for God's hope, peace, love, and joy. Write that down. Write down the headlines and the hopes that you have from last year and for the coming years. If you want just a little extra credit, come and share it with me. I would love to sit with you and talk about that in the coming days and weeks and months. As we do that, may you and I, may we as a church remember the truth, the good news that God is here. And that truth of God's presence is the way we begin every new year. Thanks be to God. Amen.